The words that changed everything came from the most unexpected source, a homeless man feeding pigeons on a park bench. "Sometimes the universe speaks through the most unlikely messengers," he said to 7-year-old Ethan, who hadn't uttered a single word since his mother's death 3 years ago. What happened next would transform not just Ethan's life, but his father's empire, and the lives of thousands who would eventually hear their story. If this journey of connection, healing, and finding voice in silence touches your heart, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more stories that remind us of our shared humanity. Now, let's begin where all meaningful journeys start, with a single step into the unknown. Michael Chen stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office, 40 stories above Manhattan. The skyline stretched before him like a kingdom, and in many ways, it was. As CEO of Horizon Technologies, he commanded a workforce of thousands, controlled billions in assets, and was featured regularly in Fortune and Forbes. His face was recognized at every exclusive restaurant and event in the city. But none of that mattered when he looked at the framed photo on his desk, his son Ethan, frozen in time at age 4, laughing on a beach in the Hamptons, his mother Sarah kneeling beside him building a sandcastle. It was the last vacation they took together before the cancer diagnosis that changed everything. "Mr. Chen, your 3 o'clock is waiting," his assistant's voice came through the intercom. Michael straightened his tie, tucked away the grief that perpetually lived just beneath his polished exterior, and turned from the window. "Send them in." His days followed a predictable pattern: meetings, decisions, acquisitions, growth. Michael excelled at business because business made sense. It followed rules. Unlike life, which had taken his wife at 34 and, in many ways, had taken his son too. Ethan hadn't spoken a word since Sarah died. Not one. The specialists called it selective mutism, triggered by trauma. "He'll speak when he's ready," they said. But 3 years had passed, and Michael was beginning to lose hope. Every evening, Michael would return to their penthouse apartment where Mrs. Abernathy, Ethan's nanny, would give him the same report with slight variations: "He ate well today," or "He didn't finish his lunch," or "He seemed to enjoy his art therapy." What remained constant was the silence. Michael would sit with Ethan, reading to him, showing him models of new tech products, sometimes just sitting in quiet companionship. Ethan would listen, occasionally nod, sometimes smile, but never speak. His eyes, so like Sarah's, seemed to hold entire conversations that Michael couldn't access. That Friday, Michael left work early. It was the anniversary of Sarah's death, and he couldn't bear the sympathetic glances from employees who remembered. He dismissed Mrs. Abernathy for the weekend and decided he would take Ethan to Central Park himself, something he rarely had time to do. "Would you like that, buddy? Just you and me this weekend?" Michael asked as they rode the elevator down from their apartment. Ethan nodded, his small hand in Michael's larger one. The park was alive with spring, dogwoods blooming, children playing, tourists photographing everything. Michael felt a pang watching other families, mothers and fathers with children who called out, laughed, asked questions. The sound of children's voices was both beautiful and painful. They walked to the model boat pond, where Ethan liked to watch the miniature sailboats glide across the water. Michael had bought him one for Christmas, but Ethan had never shown interest in sailing it himself. It remained pristine in its box at home. "Do you want an ice cream?" Michael asked, pointing to a vendor nearby. Ethan shook his head. "Just want to watch the boats?" A nod. Michael sighed and settled onto a bench, checking his phone for emails. He'd promised himself he wouldn't work this weekend, but habit was strong, and focusing on business problems was easier than facing the hollow space between him and his son. He was deep into a financial report when he realized Ethan was no longer beside him. Panic surged through him as he jumped up, scanning the area. "Ethan? Ethan!" Then he spotted him, just 20 feet away, sitting on another bench beside an elderly man who was tossing bread crumbs to pigeons. Relief flooded Michael, followed immediately by concern. He'd lectured Ethan countless times about strangers. He hurried over, ready to scold and apologize simultaneously, when something stopped him short. Ethan was smiling, not his usual polite smile, but a genuine one that reached his eyes. The old man was talking, his weathered hands gesturing expressively as pigeons gathered around their feet. The man looked to be in his 70s, with a gray beard and clothes that had seen better days. A small cart containing what appeared to be all his worldly possessions was parked beside the bench. Michael approached cautiously. "I'm sorry if my son is bothering you," he said. The old man looked up, his eyes startlingly clear and blue in his weathered face. "No bother at all. We've been having a fine conversation, haven't we, young fellow?" Michael felt a familiar ache. "I'm afraid my son doesn't speak." "Is that so?" The man seemed genuinely surprised. "Well, perhaps not with words, but he speaks in other ways. He's got expressive eyes, this one. Just like my daughter had." Michael sat down beside Ethan, who was watching the pigeons with fascination. "I'm Michael Chen," he offered, extending his hand. "Joseph," the man replied, his handshake firm despite his apparent age. "But most folks around here call me Park Joe." "Do you live in the park?" Michael asked carefully. Joseph chuckled. "Not officially, but I spend most of my days here. The nights I spend at various shelters, depending on the weather and availability. Been this way since my wife passed and the medical bills took everything else." Michael felt a twinge of guilt about the penthouse sitting empty most days while he worked, about the vacation homes rarely visited. "What did you do, before?" Michael asked. "I was a professor of literature at Columbia, if you can believe it," Joseph said without a hint of self-pity. "Specialized in mythology and folklore from around the world. Stories are powerful things, Mr. Chen. They're how we make sense of our lives." Michael watched as Ethan carefully took a piece of bread from Joseph's paper bag and tossed it to a pigeon. "My son hasn't spoken since his mother died 3 years ago," Michael found himself saying. "The doctors call it selective mutism." Joseph nodded thoughtfully. "In many stories, silence is not the absence of voice but the presence of something too big for words. In Norse mythology, Odin hung from the world tree for 9 days in silence before he received the wisdom of the runes." Michael wasn't sure what to make of this, but Ethan seemed captivated. "Sometimes," Joseph continued, "the universe speaks through the most unlikely messengers. Perhaps your son is waiting for the right message, or the right messenger." Ethan looked up at Joseph then, his eyes wide and attentive. "Would you like to hear a story, young man?" Joseph asked. "It's about a bird who forgot how to sing." Ethan nodded eagerly. Michael checked his watch. He had emails to answer, a conference call he should prepare for, but something in Ethan's expression made him stay. Joseph began his tale, his voice taking on a rhythmic quality that seemed to blend with the ambient sounds of the park. "Once, there was a little nightingale with the most beautiful voice in the forest. All the other animals would gather each evening to hear him sing. But one terrible day, a storm came and destroyed his nest, and in his grief, the nightingale forgot how to sing." Michael felt Ethan press against his side, listening intently. "The nightingale tried and tried, but no sound would come. The other animals offered advice. 'Drink this special water,' said the deer. 'Eat these rare berries,' said the rabbit. 'Practice all day long,' said the squirrel. But nothing worked." Joseph paused to toss more bread to the pigeons. Finally, the nightingale met an old turtle who didn't tell him to do anything at all. The turtle simply said, "I will listen when you are ready to sing." And every day, the turtle would sit quietly beside the nightingale, not expecting anything. Michael felt a lump forming in his throat. Then one day, as they sat together watching the sunset turn the sky all shades of orange and pink, the nightingale opened his beak, not because he was trying to sing, but because the sunset was so beautiful he couldn't keep his feelings inside anymore. And out came a single, perfect note. Ethan was completely still, his eyes fixed on Joseph. The turtle smiled and said, "That was worth waiting for." And from that day on, the nightingale sang again, not because anyone expected him to, but because he had something he wanted to share. Joseph finished his story and smiled at Ethan. "Sometimes, young man, the words will come when there's something you simply must say, and not a moment before." Michael was about to thank Joseph for the story when Ethan did something unexpected. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small toy car, his favorite, one that had belonged to Michael as a child, and placed it in Joseph's weathered hand. "That's very kind," Joseph said, examining the car. "But this looks special. Are you sure you want me to have it?" Ethan nodded firmly. "Then I thank you. I shall treasure it." As they prepared to leave, Michael impulsively reached for his wallet. "Please, let me." Joseph held up his hand. "I don't need your money, Mr. Chen. But if you want to help, there's a shelter on East 77th that could use donations for their children's program. Books, especially. Stories matter." Michael nodded, somewhat chastened. "Thank you for your time today. And the story. It was my pleasure. Perhaps we'll see each other again." As they walked away, Michael felt Ethan tugging at his hand, looking back at Joseph. "Would you like to come back tomorrow?" Michael asked. Ethan nodded vigorously. "Then we will." That night, as Michael tucked Ethan into bed, he noticed a change in his son. There was an alertness, an engagement that had been missing for so long. "Did you like Joseph's story?" Michael asked. Ethan nodded, then pointed to his bookshelf. Michael selected a book, one of Sarah's favorites, to read to Ethan, and began to read. Halfway through, he realized Ethan was mouthing some of the words silently. It was the most communication he'd shown in 3 years. The next day, they returned to the park, but Joseph wasn't at the bench. Ethan's disappointment was palpable. "He might come later," Michael suggested. "Or maybe he's at another part of the park." They spent hours searching, but there was no sign of Park Joe. As the afternoon waned, Michael reluctantly suggested they head home. "We can try again tomorrow," he promised. But the next day yielded the same result. And the next. By Monday, Michael had to return to work, but he arranged for Mrs. Abernathy to take Ethan to the park each day to look for Joseph. A week passed with no success. Michael made inquiries at the shelter Joseph had mentioned, but no one there knew of a former literature professor named Joseph. It was as if he had vanished. Ethan grew increasingly withdrawn again. Michael feared they were losing the small progress they'd made. Then, 2 weeks after their encounter with Joseph, Michael was working late in his home office when he heard something that made him freeze, a small, rusty voice, unpracticed but unmistakable. "Dad?" Michael rushed to Ethan's room to find his son sitting up in bed, clutching a book, the same one Michael had read the night after they met Joseph. "Ethan? Did you just speak?" "The nightingale," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm like the nightingale." Michael felt tears spring to his eyes as he gathered his son in his arms. "Yes, buddy. Yes, you are." "I miss Mom," Ethan said, his small body trembling with the effort of pushing out words that had been trapped for so long. "I miss her too," Michael said, his own voice breaking. "So much. But she's still here." Ethan placed a hand on his chest. "Joseph said people we love are never really gone. They become part of our stories." Michael held his son tighter, wondering at the wisdom this stranger had imparted. Joseph was right. Over the following days, Ethan's words came slowly at first, then in a rush, as if a dam had broken. He spoke of memories of Sarah that Michael thought he'd been too young to retain. He asked questions about her, what her favorite color was, if she liked pistachio ice cream, whether she had been afraid at the end. Michael answered as honestly as he could, finding healing in the conversations he'd thought they'd never have. Each evening, they would read together, and Michael would share stories about Sarah that made Ethan laugh and sometimes cry. They continued to visit the park, hoping to find Joseph to thank him, but he never reappeared. Michael made good on his promise to donate to the shelter, establishing a library program that provided books for homeless children. As weeks turned into months, Ethan's progress amazed his doctors and teachers. His silence had not affected his intelligence. If anything, his years of observation had given him insights beyond his years. One evening, as Michael was helping Ethan with homework, his son asked, "Do you think Joseph was real?" The question caught Michael off guard. "Of course he was real. We both met him." Ethan considered this. "But no one else has seen him. And he knew exactly what story I needed to hear." Michael thought about the clear blue eyes in that weathered face, the wisdom in Joseph's words. "Sometimes," he said, echoing Joseph's words, "the universe speaks through the most unlikely messengers." 6 months after their encounter in the park, Michael found himself standing at a podium, addressing the annual shareholder meeting of Horizon Technologies. But instead of discussing profit margins and market expansion, he was announcing the launch of the Sarah Chen Foundation, dedicated to supporting children dealing with grief and trauma. "My late wife believed that every child deserves a voice," Michael said, his confidence in public speaking now matched by a newfound emotional openness. "And thanks to a chance encounter, or perhaps not chance at all, my son found his voice again after years of silence." In the front row sat Ethan, now 8 years old, watching his father with pride. Beside him was Mrs. Abernathy, who had become more family than employee. The foundation will fund research into childhood trauma and grief, provide therapy services for families who cannot afford them, and establish storytelling programs in hospitals and schools. Because sometimes, healing begins with a story. The initiative was met with enthusiastic support, not just from shareholders who appreciated the positive publicity, but from employees who had watched their driven but distant CEO transform into a more compassionate leader. Michael had begun leaving work at reasonable hours, delegating more responsibilities to his capable team. He'd even started a book club for employees, inspired by Joseph's belief in the power of stories. After the meeting, as they walked through the lobby of Horizon Tower, Ethan spotted something that made him stop short, a small display case containing a familiar toy car. "Dad, that's my car. The one I gave to Joseph." Michael knelt beside his son, equally puzzled. "You're right. But how did it get here?" The security guard at the front desk overheard them. "Oh, that old thing? A homeless man dropped it off about a month ago. Said it belonged to the CEO's son and should be returned. We were going to throw it away, but the cleaning staff thought it might be important, so they put it in the display case." Michael felt a chill run down his spine. "Did he leave a name?" "No, sir. Just said you'd understand." That evening, Michael and Ethan sat on their balcony, watching the lights of the city come alive as darkness fell. "Do you think we'll ever see Joseph again?" Ethan asked. Michael considered the question carefully. "I don't know. But I think he came into our lives exactly when we needed him, and maybe that was enough." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "Like in the stories. The helper appears, gives the hero what they need, and then disappears. When did you get so wise?" Michael asked, ruffling his son's hair. "I've always been wise," Ethan replied with a grin. "I just wasn't talking." They both laughed, the sound carrying out over the city, a city that no longer felt like Michael's kingdom, but rather a community they were part of, filled with stories they were just beginning to hear. A year later, the Sarah Chen Foundation had helped hundreds of children find their voices through innovative therapy programs and storytelling workshops. Michael had scaled back his role at Horizon to devote more time to the foundation and, more importantly, to Ethan. They still visited Central Park regularly, and though they never saw Joseph again, they often sat on his bench, feeding the pigeons and